Well, thank you so much, everybody. Welcome to today's CineLink's talk panel hosted by Sarajevo Film Festival, Documentary Campus, and Screen International. My name is Paula Vaccaro, and I'm here to moderate this talk. CineLink Talks is a program of 11 webinars who have been running from 15th to the 20th of August, they will go, and it's the industry strand of the Sarajevo Film Festival, which was moved online, of course, because of COVID-19. Our talk would last 1 hour, and we will leave 20 minutes approximately for questions from the audience. So please make this talk also yours by leaving your questions on the Q&A box, and I will try to go through as many as possible. Today's talk is the last talk of the talks I have curated and designed. So I am very happy, but I'm also a bit sad that this is ending because we've had some really exciting conversations. And today is the talk of imagining a radically new way to curate and review, because actually what we want to talk about is about gatekeeping. And if gatekeeping starts with festivals and reviewers, how can we demand that selections understand intersectionality and a plurality of voices where BIPOC film programmers and film reviewers, who are also joining forces to support this shift of power, can make sure that their views are also on the table. So today, to talk about this, we have 4 wonderful people, starting with Bedatri Choudhury. She studied literature and cinema in New Delhi and attended graduate school and cinema studies at Tisch School of the Arts. And she has worked extensively with documentary films, particularly in the areas of productions and commissioning and outreach. She's an editor and a film critic, and writes about film in several publications like Huffington Post and Hyperallergic and BuzzFeed and Movie Notebook and Bitch Magazine. And she has worked with various publishing houses and is an alumni of the New York Film Festival, Critics Academy, Sundance, and South by Southwest. We also have Kaleem Aftab, who's a film producer, festival strategist, and film critic, and he's internationally renowned for conducting engaging interviews, observing cinema trends, and populating film festivals. He writes about film for major international publication and is frequently seen on television. Kaleem has authored the official Spike Lee biography, That's My Story, and I'm sticking to it. He lives in London. Welcome, Kaleem. Faridah Gbadamosi is a pop culture obsessed lover of film, working towards making the space more inclusive. In particular, she's interested in changing the space of tastemakers, both in what gets curated and also who does the curate. She is currently the director of programming for the Coven Film Festival, a festival that showcases the work of filmmakers from marginalized genders, lead programmer at Outstream Film Festival, and an online queer film festival, and the US Indie Programming Fellow for the 43rd Mill Valley Film Festival. She was recently named one of the fellows of the inaugural Film Festival Leadership Lab from the Film Festival Alliance and the Full Spectrum Features. And Elma Tataragić is a scriptwriter and a professor and a festival programmer. She graduated from the Dramaturgy at Sarajevo Academy of Performing Arts and has been working as a selector for competition programs and CineLink industry days at the Sarajevo Film Festival since 1995. She is also a scriptwriter with a very long career as a scriptwriter and a creator, and she has been also teaching screenwriting at the Sarajevo Academy of Performing Arts, and she has also worked as a general secretary of the Association of Filmmakers in Bosnia and Herzegovina until last year. So without much ado, let's just kickstart this. I would like that everybody who wants to add a question, of course, please do so in the Q&A. And my first question will be, I will just ask the same question to all of you. I am interested in knowing about the hurdles, right? The obstacles that you find to do the work that you want to do. And maybe Bedatri, you want to start?
I think one of the biggest, and I was just, like 5 minutes ago reading this IndieWire report that's just come out 2 hours ago saying that, wait, let me just pull it up. I have it open in the other window. The headline is Male Film Critics Still Outnumber Female. All critics of color remain dramatically underrepresented. So that is a hurdle. Also, I think intellectually, one of the biggest hurdles I face while writing film criticism is because I am from South Asia, I kind of get cornered into writing about South Asian films. And I think one of the biggest hurdles for me is to make editors, convince editors that I can write about other things as well. So those are the two hurdles.
Kaleem?
Let me unmute myself. Hi, everyone. I think there's many hurdles. I mean, there's obviously the start of the hurdle is we all have barriers that are our barriers to entry, which is what's just been touched upon. But then once we are in, then we have the barriers of persuasion. How do we persuade editors that the stories we want to tell are interesting, that stories outside are interesting? There's also the barriers of capitalism that for ages and still ongoing, that people want to talk about what they perceive as having value, whether that's clickbait value or commercial value from advertising, and how does that fit in with the strand of what's going on and what's bigger and what's a wider sphere, and how do we touch upon that and how do we break that down? Because often that is very illusionary. It's the secondary battles that are more difficult for everybody. The argument that the audience isn't interested or someone else, everything that is a kind of side view that is an excuse not to tackle the issues, which is opening up both festival programs, for example, when we look at selections that have hardly any female directors, and the arguments are, well, we had X number of films submitted and there were male directors and it's an industry problem. Whereas if people want to make change, they will make change. And diverting responsibility from themselves is one of the major problems.
Thank you. Elma, I'm interested in your take.
Well, I totally, hello everyone, first of all. I totally agree with Kaleem and Bedatri. But from my point of view, as I'm somebody who is coming from Sarajevo Film Festival, and we have, we are coming from a very small cinema. We are coming from this very small country producing very few films. And that was our biggest obstacle from the beginning, since we have started the festival. And it's not only an obstacle for the film festival, it's actually an obstacle for the entire film industry and how it's treated nationally and internationally as well. But frankly, what we do is actually we turn our obstacle into the focus of our work. So basically, as the festival has been profiled to present films from the region, we actually decided to deal with our obstacles in a very upfront way. So this barrier still exists, even though we have become the hub for all of these small countries from the region we are covering, and we have become the festival who is known for covering Southeastern European cinema. But at the same time, it's not only about there are two things to this focus we have. One is that it's not only about Sarajevo. It's not only about how do I pick films and how do I curate them and how do I put them out at the festival. It's also the fact that the promotion of these films from these very small countries throughout the year at bigger festivals affect my work as well. While on the other side, I have another obstacle, which was actually, now it's not anymore. It's how do you promote a film, which is not your national film, which is a film from a neighboring country or other very small country, to your local audience. So basically, I think it's interesting how we can really deal with obstacles when we put them into focus, when we really realize what they are and try to work on them. So I think that somehow obstacles are part of the work, at least part of my everyday work, from every day, not only during August when we promote the films from the region. The fact that, at least from my point of view, we're coming from a very small region with very small number of films, relatively quite underestimated worldwide, is the biggest hurdle that we have, and that's not the fact only for the film festival, but also for me as a filmmaker, for me as a professor, and for all my colleagues.
Thank you, Elma. I understand the obstacles of the industry in the mechanism that you describe. I wonder if you ever find obstacles to things that you want to achieve personally beyond the institutional. Maybe you want to achieve more gender equality, maybe about race. Is there anything personal to yourself that you see that you had obstacles and you haven't been able to change them just because you put yourself in focus on the obstacle, right? Maybe these are like institutional and mechanisms that you describe, but I don't hear what you find yourself as an obstacle to what you would like to achieve if you had the power and those mechanisms were not a problem.
Definitely the fact that women are underestimated has affected my career and the way I work and the way I function within the industry locally and globally. It's something absolutely number one, I'd say.
Thank you. Faridah, I'm extremely interested in your opinion on what's been your obstacle to create the work and the change that you want to do, that you want to create.
Yeah, so first, again, hello. I agree with everyone. There's lots of system mechanisms. For me personally, I don't have a traditional introduction into film. I did not go to film school. I went to college pre-med, left pre-law. I'm in the United States and I have immigrant parents. Those were my only options. But I eventually fell into film. And I've always loved film. And one of the things that I find particularly hard is that a lot of film scholarship is kind of based in white male cis pedagogy. So like I come in and my film history comes from watching a lot of TV and lots of films on my own growing up. And a lot of that isn't valued as much. I always start my bios, as you mentioned, with pop culture obsessed. Because as a person, yes, I can talk about Black Orpheus and Fellini films and stuff of that nature, but I also enjoy watching things that are popular. And our industry consistently does not value what everyday people enjoy. And frequently what everyday means to them is women and POC and anything other than that white male pedagogy. So like that is always consistently a barrier for me, where I'm trying to get people to see that movies aren't bad per se, they're just good for a different audience. And I find that to be moving the industry from good and bad to good for this group is something that I am consistently running against barriers for. The conception of like guilty pleasures and not understanding that audiences enjoy films, and that's not like a bad thing, seems to be like a problem that I consistently have within my space. And also just like running against individuals who want to talk about things that I just don't want to. I enjoy things and I don't want to spend my time hating on content is the word I can describe it, but talking about all the things they did wrong and rather talk about the things that I enjoyed. Because enjoyment is unfortunately sometimes in our space not a thing that we're comfortable talking about.
Thank you. Yes, I think that one of the other things that came up in the conversations we've been having these days is about, the gatekeeping has a very skewed vision of what is good, right? And what is desirable. And we talked about how many times, we see women being abused on screen and that's considered acceptable, and other films that maybe are about, or a film or a series about a mother that lost her son by being killed by the police is just labeled as depressing, right? Whereas the woman being raped every 5 minutes, Bina Sood was making this example, is just acceptable and exciting in a way, and gives it, and so from that, we talked about the several targets, for example, that film festivals had, you know, the 50-50 by 2020, hello, 2020, and yet here we are. And how can we hold our industry and festivals and the way we present the industry accountable? An idea of stop talking about diversity in terms of inclusion and start talking about accountability. Bedatri, I see you going like this. I would love to have you chipping on this one.
Well, I missed saying hi to everyone. I just jumped to talking the last time. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I do think one way of doing it is changing the standards. You know, like you said, if you're still if film festivals or film publications are still going to think, and it's nothing against Fellini or whoever, if you're still going to think that is the benchmark for good cinema, a benchmark that has excluded people of color systemically, and like Faridah was saying, you know, if you as a film critic, if I as a film critic am going to write about films that are only coming out of film school filmmakers, I am not looking at filmmakers who probably couldn't afford film school. Like, film school in the US is prohibitively expensive. So, you know, I do think there needs to be a complete redressal of standards. Like, you know, if you're going to think, you know, we have to change the definition of the perfect film or the perfect review. And because we can't have the same standards that have been systemically excluding people of color, women, people, queer people, you know. So I think the first thing we should do as reviewers and programmers is just change that notion of what a good film is and what a good film should be.
Faridah, would you like to join in on this one too?
Yeah, I also think some of it is also changing out some of the gatekeepers. One of the other barriers that I wanted to talk to before was there's a limited number of roles, at least the way the system is currently created. There's not lots of programming roles. There's not lots of like film reviewers. Film reviewers has kind of been democratized by blogging and more online spaces, but like film festivals, I mean, we're all in a virtual world, so like that's different. But in general, it's a space that is very hard to get into. And once you're in, most people don't leave. So there's not much in the way of roles. So some of it is also just like changing out. And it's like an uncomfortable reality, but some of it is changing out who's gatekeeping. So like you can try to convince a person to change their entire culture view, because that's essentially what we're trying to do, shift culture. But it's easier to just put someone in that space who has that culture understanding already, than to convince someone who's so ingrained in a very specific mindset that like, this is what good and this isn't bad. That doesn't mean like everyone has to lose their jobs, but it does mean change the model that one person has that much power. Like, put another person next to them, change the model in which we discuss film and who programs film, so that we are bringing in different voices, changing essentially the conversation by literally bringing someone who already knows how to.
Thank you. Elma, I was thinking in this space that there is a small industry, like you were saying, in Sarajevo, and you've been for a long time in the festival, right? How does this resonate to you, this idea of total shift?
Well, I think that it's a crucial idea, this total shift, not only in terms of gatekeeping, in terms of curating, but in terms of how we make films and what do we make films about and for whom we make films. And I think this year will also be quite interesting in this. I mean, it has been challenging us in a different level, which we did not expect. Well, coming from a small cinema, sometimes you feel like you are really stuck somewhere at the back. And even if you go up front and you think you made quite a progress, you're still not even in the middle. And that is somehow quite discouraging, especially for young filmmakers. I mean, we have wonderful filmmakers who are already middle-aged, but they never have managed to make films exactly for the reasons that they do not belong to the mainstream, even if we can talk about the mainstream in a small cinema like ours. And they have so much to say, but their voices cannot be heard. And the fact that cinema is sort of, I mean, even though we have micro budget films and small budget films and low budget films and all of these things, sometimes this is not enough, because cinema is in a way expensive, especially if you're coming from a poor country and a small country. And it's a pity. And for me, as somebody who has been connected with the film festival since its beginnings, one of the most important things and one of the most important platforms that we have created is actually our industry part of the festival, because suddenly we were not only there at the end of the road for the filmmakers, suddenly we have become involved at the beginning, and somehow we have managed to nurture or to give a voice to those who were not able to find their voice in small countries. I'm not talking only about Bosnia, but I'm talking about all of these small countries, very small cinemas with not so much money. And 20 years ago, it was really disastrous. So I think we have to be we cannot only stick to our work, we cannot only stick to what we are doing, we have to really do a lot, which is not necessarily our job. So we have to look at the industry as a whole and see where we can really help. Not say that, yes, I have only seen these 20 films, so out of these 20 films I will watch only 2. I mean, it's a process which we have to go back at the beginning and try to see what are the hurdles, not only for us, as I'm talking now as somebody coming from a film festival, but also for filmmakers who do not have a voice, because they come where they come from. It's the same if they're of wrong color, of wrong country, of wrong religion, of wrong meaning to what is kind of a standard. I think we are all kind of discussing the same thing, but I think we are at the place where we really have to do a lot of work, which is not necessarily only our work, especially if we have some kind of power to change how the films are viewed, how the films are made, how the films are financed, and finally, of course, how the films are promoted and how the films are brought to the audiences.
Thank you. I like the idea of those voices that you're saying. I generally don't like the idea of filmmakers who don't have a voice and giving someone a voice. I think everybody has a voice, and everybody has their voice has been there all along, and we just decide to amplify those voices or not. And this is where I think the shift is, and this is where actually the power resides when you are a film programmer or a film reviewer. So I really think that we this idea of what is good, right? And I think Bedatri was mentioning Fellini, right? And I went back and tried to watch Amarcord recently, and I have to say I really struggled, and it's almost sacrilegious to say it. I struggled with gender, I struggled with race, I found it unbearable. I would never say it's a bad film, but it is because it's not bad cinema in itself, but it's a complicated way to the storytelling. The gaze was too much something I don't want to keep seeing in a way. So I want you, Kaleem, to talk a bit about this power, right? You also, as a man, have the upper hand in the power structure out there.
In some power structures, for sure. I think that's an interesting question that everyone raises, is in terms of if we're talking about the canon and what's good. Obviously now we're looking backwards, and where a lot of us are saying the films that have traditionally been championed are not as good as, for example, Agnes Varda had a revival. But we can look at some of the Russians who are still not talked about, who are winning Cannes, who are winning prizes, and then do not get allowed to make films. The other problem that we have is when we do raise our own opinions. I remember there was a film, Under the Skin, that's loved, Jonathan Glazer film. And for me, that film was so problematic because it ends with the fear of rape at the end of the film. It also has a character who goes around Glasgow, a very multi-ethnic city. We don't see anybody from Asian culture who make up a very large percentage because the director didn't look. So I was just like, very much like, I hate this film. I can't help it, no matter what you say about it. I can't get over the fact that it's through such a white prism, or that it's still playing on this idea of tension being created by sexual violence. So we're looking at through these norms, we're trying to overcome them. And then when we talk about that, you find that you're a lonely voice. I remember at that time, I wrote a review for a national newspaper and I gave the film 1 star. Every other review was 5-star in the UK for this film. And it's still a loved film. And that is because it continues, as Bedatri mentioned earlier, that the paradigm is it's still the white male critic. So how do we change that? Then that's a good question, because we can amplify ourselves where it managed to get through. But what we got to talk about is how digital has transformed the scenario. And that's in 2 ways. First of all, with streaming of films, the way that Netflix have like Amazon and the new players are looking for cinema throughout the whole world rather than just from the traditional areas. They've realized that local is global. And also by the way that people are trying to block us talking, and the way that the whole conversation around cancel culture has happened. I hate the term cancel culture because actually what people are trying to do is talk about systems that need to be changed. And when it's talked in the terms of cancelling, no one wants to cancel culture. In fact, it's the opposite. We want to actually look in the past and show a much broader history and talk about a history in a wider context. It's more calling out than cancelling. The only people who are cancelling are the people in the past. So we need to take control of the language and we need to actually see what has the internet done. And I think it's 2 things that are beautiful. Is it's taken power away from the traditional people that hold power. And it's also given an ability to shame people, because we can't discount shame is such a good tool for creating change.
I am not sure that we end up by shaming, we end up creating the change we want. But I do hear you, and I think that you are really putting the focus on this idea of cancel culture and regaining that. It's the length that some people who are gatekeepers of culture, to call them whatever way, will go to justify what they are hearing and that they don't want to hear or that they don't want to happen, to me is always an amazing point, right? Is you have wrote, for example, in your case, Kaleem, you have wrote a book about Spike Lee, and recently Spike decided to criticize Woody Allen, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm backtracking on this. I believe the victims. I think this is the way. And some people were talking, and especially online, were talking about Spike Lee just bending for power and bending to the oppression that he was feeling from audiences online. And I thought, but can you go that long into someone who has been talking and speaking against, he has been talking truth to power all his life? Do you really think that this person is going to just bend over because audiences are putting pressure? He's a person who's been talking truth to power all his life, right? So the mechanisms of the status quo that are out there are placed in such interesting places. So this doesn't change. And people would just go really, really far and wide, not believing the obvious, just to keep control of what is in place. right?
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms of, for example, a much easier and simpler example is when Spike Lee calls out racism. Very early on in his career, a lot of people called Spike Lee racist. There were many articles where they said he hated white people, for example, which is patently untrue. He was working with everybody. But it was a very big dynamic that happens if someone promotes women, all of a sudden they hate men, etc. And that's the paradigm that we're working in and that we need to work against. But that's going to happen because the system is very good at changing and adapting to keep themselves in power.
Absolutely. Faridah, does this, I see you nodding as well. This, do you want to chip in on this part of the conversation?
I mean, I think all power structures that exist to maintain power. Even when we look at the way, like racism in media, one of the interesting things I've always thought about race is up until the early 20th century, Italians and Irish people were not considered white in the United States. So like, it was for the power structures to include them within the system. So like a lot of these power structures will just redefine the line to maintain power as it currently exists. And I think that happens in media all the time. They will just accept one or two things in order to just maintain that current system. It's kind of like when they say things like, this is a unicorn filmmaker. Yes, you are acknowledging their like ability, but you're also implying that this person is special amongst that group. I remember when Shonda Rhimes got her show, a lot of it was she's a unicorn showrunner. Yes, it might seem like you're celebrating Shonda Rhimes, but what you're essentially saying is Shonda is the special Black woman. She's the one who can do all this, rather than admitting, we've created a system that makes it impossible for people like Shonda Rhimes and other Black women and people of color to like come in, and I think we lost our moderator, to come in, and there we go.
Sorry, if you don't get ejected, it's not a Zoom. Apologies, I don't know what happened there. I missed what Faridah was saying, but I guess you commented on power.
I was just saying
on power.
Some of the things that we do, like the naming, of like how we name people unicorns or stuff of that nature, the goal is to continue to other so that you don't have to let anyone else in. You let in one to prove that you can, but then don't let anyone else in by using very specific language. And that's kind of how power consistently, continuously works, which is the reason why also the way we name things and the way we talk about things is also really important as like as reviewers and programmers. The language we use is so important because sometimes the language is also just recreating those power structures.
Absolutely, and somebody's saying, well said, Faridah, and I have to add, well said, Faridah, absolutely. Yes, I hear you all the way. And Bedatri, you were also nodding, and I'm interested in your take on this bit.
No, and to absolutely echo what Faridah said, like, the idea of the unicorn filmmaker is so much like the idea of, and this is where I think whenever we talk about reviewing film, reviewing culture or programming festivals, we have to look at the larger picture. Elma talked about it as well. It's the same as how the American society made the model minority myth, like how they took people from Asia, called them model minority, and told them, oh, you're good, you're not like the Blacks. So that is the idea when you like pick up one person of color, one woman of color, and make them the perfect example of excellence, of progress, and of talent. Then the problem is, and especially because I was at Sundance this year, and Dee Rees, and whose Mudbound I'm an absolute fan of. So the film she made with Anne Hathaway, I'm forgetting the name, it premiered at Sundance, and it wasn't so good. So what happens is when you take someone like Dee Rees and make her the epitome of this is a unicorn Black woman queer filmmaker, and the moment she slips, it's like she's not allowed. Whenever you make that model example, you are not allowed to fail. And that is inhuman. Like, no male filmmaker ever in history has been told that you can't fail. Or you make one good film and you can never fail again. I think that, I mean, as critics, as programmers, we have to open up to the idea of, you know, allowing mediocrity, especially to communities who have not been allowed to excel. And I mean, nobody, like, you know, we've had 100 years of cinema and more. Nobody stopped. I don't think too many male filmmakers were stopped and said, hey, you're making mediocre films, please stop. But the moment Dee Rees makes a not so all right film, it's just like Dee Rees should just stop making films. You know, that whole idea. And it's very, I remember when Wonder Woman released in the US, it was just like, oh my God, let this film do well. Because if this film doesn't do well, then that's it for women in Hollywood, you know. And people said the same thing about Crazy Rich Asians. Like, I remember the filmmaker saying that he was like, if this film did not do well, then that was it for Asians in Hollywood. And that is an inhuman pressure.
Absolutely, and it made me think while you were talking, and this relates, of course, to Elma and the Balkans. You know, the male director, the mythology of the great auteur that Europeans go through in regions like the Balkans, where, you know, the biggest directors have been the epitome of the male big auteur director. You know, women filmmakers have to go through that, minority filmmakers have to go through that, plus all the things that you mentioned. How do you live through, let's say, as a programmer and creator yourself, Elma, in Europe and in the Balkans especially as well, where this very male cinema culture has imposed its weight over most everybody who's not the big male director?
Well, there was something quite interesting said about the power structures, and that is basically what we are still talking about, and your question refers to that. And how do we change the power structures, and how actually the power structures exist just to keep the power, and how they adapt by little things so they can still stay alive. We had something, I mean, it's maybe will sound radical, but we had a major shift in power. We actually had the collapse of the power structure because of the war. So basically in the 90s of the last century, so 30 years ago, we had the war in ex-Yugoslavia, we had the whole dissemination of the country, and the power structure totally crashed, especially in my society, especially in Bosnia, where we had this horrible war for years. What happened is quite interesting. We had the whole generation of, usually, you know, it was male. I mean, when I'm talking about culture and film, it was, you know, the male power structure. Middle-aged men, they disappeared. They went away from the country, basically, most of them. Some of them stayed, but they went away from the country. So suddenly there was this new generation of filmmakers with no idols. This shifted the entire film industry. It took us a lot of time, many years. It didn't take 1 year, but in 10 years, it shifted the entire. It kind of, we kind of were reset, and reset to some new settings that nobody knew. But suddenly, it was a new generation of filmmakers who were in their 20s or early 30s. And who were not leaning on the power structures, because these power structures disappeared. And we had to make our own power structures. This allowed something quite new. I mean, you can see the result. For example, before the war in Bosnia, among many feature films that we have produced, only 2 feature films were directed by a woman. 1 woman directed 2 feature films. So in the history of Bosnian cinema, until 1992, we only had 1 female director. Ever since the war, we have major female voices, because suddenly, you know, there was the power structure totally disappeared. So basically, what was a biggest disaster for the entire society, for many people, the war, it really was very, if you look at it from a point of view of filmmaking or culture, it was somehow very interesting, and the results were quite good in a way, because the power structures disappeared. We had to, on our own, all together, reconstruct them. Well, not reconstructed, we had to make new power structures. Of course, we did make some mistakes. The power structures, that's the worst thing with the power structures. Once you put them out, they're interesting when they're creating, but once you have them on power, once they become really powerful, they're not good anymore. So we do have to kind of renew them again and question them again. But it was interesting for the Balkans in general, because this idea of this male auteur was not trendy anymore, because it didn't really function in reality. Right now, it's really interesting, especially in Bosnian cinema, to hear so many female voices and so many male voices as well at the same time, which are quite equal in how they are, how loud they are, but still. Questioning the power structures, even if you belong to them, I think is quite essential. So, of course, sometimes we do not have capacity for this. Sometimes we are too much into our own things that we don't do that. But questioning what is missing from the power structures is always, I think, interesting. Usually, people ask me, "But how do you select films? What do you think is a good film?" I don't know what is a good film, but I'm looking at something which is missing, and I'm looking at something which is challenging something which is debating something new, bringing something new. And of course, you cannot forget your own point of view, but I just wanted to add that a radical change in society is always affecting the way the culture is built and perceived, and the way that we use our language to describe it one way or another. So it's not only connected to us speaking, it's the entire shift of the society is quite needed and required.
Thank you. I would remind everybody, if they want to put questions on the Q&A box, we are approaching our 40 minutes. In fact, we've just gone over 40 minutes. So I will be happy to take questions if you want to ask any questions. And I think that what Elma was saying, I think is so important when we look around our teams and the teams when we are in, for example, if there is a film festival that you're part of, or if you're part of a publication, look around the teams that are there, and if people all look, they all have the same color, they all have been from the same backgrounds, they all went to the same schools, they all learned the same things. That is a segregated space. You are living in a segregated space, and no real I mean, the new for the sake of the new cannot come from a different mentality and a different mindset and a different bias, because everybody is biased at the end of the day. But if it's not, the diversity and the possibilities don't show in that space. So to me, when we talk about diversity and we talk about, unconscious biases and how filmmakers are selected and reviewers, I think we're also forgetting sometimes that when we look around in those teams, people are very segregated. They're very similar, right? Faridah, do you want to talk about this?
I was just going to point out that one of the things that Elma was pointing was also like that there needs to be a culture reshift comes when there's a shift in the country. But like one of the things that I found a little bit frustrating about this period of time is the pandemic has kind of handed us this. Like we are in a moment in which we can kind of reset culture. All the film festivals are moving online. So how are you programming differently to like do that? If all films are being released online, how does that change your review structure? What's getting reviewed, because everything's being reviewed everything's being released in the same format. But we're still seeing people maintain specific power structures. So like we've been handed a kind of revolution of sorts by way of nature, and like seeing people still hold on to those power structures and not try to redefine them or change them has been like a very frustrating thing to watch, because it's like this is an opportunity to change, to redefine our organizations, to redefine how our publications work. And hopefully, I mean, that's the one thing that I can hope in these conversations. Like, I don't know if I would have been able to speak on a panel like this without the pandemic, largely because I don't normally have time to go on a plane to go somewhere, or can't afford to. So like there are shifts happening, small ones, but like we're treating them as coincidences and not opportunities. And I think we need to just like start taking these as full-on opportunities to make these sort of shifts, to see this as an opportunity to form a revolution in our space. That's my love thing.
Thank you. Kaleem, I would be very interested in your take about this bit of the power structures and the segregation inside of the, how those places are created in the UK is so pervasive.
I was going to say, living in Britain, where we have the biggest class structure that's been handed down for hundreds of years, I think it's very interesting. It's because we have, yes, this revolutionary moment in terms of the pandemic, but the society still remains the same. So then we've got to ask ourselves questions, because we do have some power now. And I definitely realize that. So how do we redefine things? So when we're given opportunities, we've always got to push the boundaries. For example, I was asked to program a season that was around Lahane, and I was like, well, how can I change this so it's not about a masculine film from a white director talking about multiculturalism? So, I looked at it and I was thinking, well, maybe I can look in the past and see some of the overlooked films. So I found, Norma Ray from the 70s, comparing that to Taxi Driver. Why is Norma Ray not held in the same esteem, when in many ways it's a much better film, and it's definitely a more radical film, and she's definitely more rebellious than Travis Bickle. And then we look forward, and I look at some of the films from recent years. I mean, I really love this film called Amateurs by Gabriella Pilcher, which won in Nordic in Gothenburg a few years ago. And it's never screened in a cinema in the UK. So I was like, well, now I have an opportunity to show this. And yes, at the same time, I will still show the Taxi Drivers, etc. But I'll try and recontextualize everything and say, this is what was happening in the past. In the present, there is change. Let's celebrate the change. And so I think in a lot of ways, what we are seeing is a position where we can take the bull by the horns and celebrate and actually say, this is what needs to be changed. If we have a moment in the public, we need to take that and spread that gospel to everybody else, which is what's great about panels like this, because we can go on board, but we have our own responsibility, and we need to take that responsibility. We can't just blame the other. We need to say, we're going to lead by example as well.
Panels like this allowed us during the pandemic to talk about these things with people that we actually really wanted to talk about with, right? Instead of the person that is always in the panel because it's the most famous person, or people who had great ideas. And in that way, I have to give the upper hand as well to the Sarajevo Film Festival and to Documentary Campus, because they allowed me to create these panels with a real dream in mind and a lot of freedom. And I'm so happy that we are having these conversations with those that we're having them, right? I know, Bedatri, you were also nodding onto this. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to have your word on this bit, on the segregation and how is that,
And, I'm thanking each of the panelists for their inputs, because it's like setting off different gears in my brain. But, being in New York during the pandemic, in the thick of Black Lives Matter, I have just realized that, film festivals and films in general can't be divorced from what else is happening in your society. I do think, and like Faridah said, that, if this is our opportunity to become like activism and programming, activism and film, organizing and film programming, they need to come together. When we see like TV channels literally saying, okay, we're gonna run, a film like Gone with the Wind is in our program, and we're going to have someone come in and give a context to the film each time that film plays, that is when you see that, like nobody's saying that stop playing Gone with the Wind. But, just to have, like, just to make that push to have TV channels or, like, big festivals or whatever, have them think about what they're doing with their programming is so essential. And I do think this is, and I think one of the biggest changes that we can make is become a part of that organization, like, become organizers, activists, and programmers at the same time. Because, when your country is burning, I don't think you can just watch a film and feel happy about it. When I grew up in India, a lot of people, it's kind of believed that you watch films to feel happy. Like, you forget everything that's going wrong in your life and you get into a theater for 3 hours and you just feel happy and come out. I don't think that is possible anymore. When your country is on fire, I think our film programs and film criticisms have to respond to that and become a comprehensive body, then become something which you watch and forget your worries about.
No, the world really is a bit up in flames these days with all the changes that we need and the changes that we want to operate on the ground, especially those of us who have not been necessarily on the mainstream of culture center place. I mean, because you have to be a white male to be that. Let's just put it that way, because it's true. So lastly, there is one question on the Q&A here that I would like to take. It says, I'd love all the views that the panelists have shared and wonder how we as individuals hold the film industry accountable and push for the radical changes some have suggested. Would Elma, for example, consider allowing a visiting programmer like Faridah to curate the next Sarajevo Film Festival? For indie filmmakers like me, the selection process of film festivals is so opaque that it makes me think we have not changed the power structure much at all. Would programmers consider making the process more transparent? And yes, I'm going to go through all the answers to this. Elma will go first, of course, because it's directed at her, if she would consider a person like Faridah.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
The visiting programmer.
Yeah, absolutely. We have programmers from around the world, and we have had since the beginning of the festival, because we wanted, the program to reflect the diversity of filmmaking around the world. So we do have, I don't want to name them, but we have several programmers from around the world. But the question is, would Cannes do this? Would Berlin be doing this? Would Venice be doing this? Because they actually hold the power and they are the main gatekeepers. Yes, we would. And I think many small festivals would, but would these big festivals do that? That is an interesting question.
Thank you. Kaleem, how do we hold the film industry accountable and push for these changes?
I think if we think about what Time's Up 50/50 did, it already made Cannes open up who was on their competition selection committee. They had to admit who was on it. It just happened to be a lot of French people who were middle class, but there was actually a gender and a male balance, but there were other problems with it. And it is still quite secretive to answer that question. How do we democratize it? I think now we're seeing a lot more festivals be more open about their programmers. Toronto, for example, changed all of their programmers in the last year. And it would have been exciting to see what their program would have been like without the pandemic, even though it's exciting anyway, but that would have been a major litmus test, which unfortunately with 2020 being a wipeout, we're not seeing that. So I think there is a will, but we need to hold them account, and we need to hold them to account by campaigning, by lobbying, by continuing to ask questions in press conferences, etc., and not letting them off the hook.
Oops, Bedatri.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, I'm so glad Kaleem brought up Toronto. 2 years back, and I had like literally published 5 things. Then I had gotten an email out of nowhere from Toronto International Film Festival, saying, we are doing this program where we are reserving a percentage of our press accreditation for women, for early career female identifying film critics. And it was my first festival, and it was fantastic because I had a community. Like, the moment I landed in Toronto, I had like 49 other women from all over the world who were doing this with me. So it wasn't like I was landing up in a film festival with chart topping imposter syndrome, not knowing anyone. And Sundance does this. Sundance has, I hate what they call it. It's called the Press Inclusion Initiative. South by Southwest has it, which basically, and it's not just women for these festivals, they reserve a part of their press corps for early career film journalists of color. And they give them passes which are reserved for the New York Times of the world. So, I think these are very small things. I don't like the word inclusion. I like the word diversity. But, I do accept that it has to start with inclusion. So I just wanted to, put these examples forth as to how things are changing a little bit. And, if 1 year it's 20 people, then one can hope that next year it'll be 50 people. And then the year after that, you won't need an initiative like that. You would have empowered like a whole generation of new film critics of color to do this on their own. So I think, I don't know, I hope I answered your question, but
Yes,
I just
yes, you
heard
did.
Kaleem say
You
Toronto
did.
and ran with it.
No, you did, and it's great to have those examples. And I think Sundance, in a way, is a luxury of a festival, because they've been thinking so much about these things for so long, and they still think of it. If there is a place where I feel we can have these conversations, and there are active conversations going on how to make it better, I feel they are coming in definitely for Sundance, like in no other festival from around the world, or as much as, of course, Sundance also has resources different from other festivals. It's bigger, and it comes with a whole other set of power, right? And Faridah, I want you to also comment on this round that started with Elma about what can we do to hold the film more accountable
Sorry.
No,
I was
please.
just gonna say, I really like the word. I really like the concept of like making film festivals less opaque. I think some of the issues that we have in our film festivals, in a lot of these spaces in general, is that some of the opaqueness is intentional, but like some of it is like, but that also becomes a barrier to entry because you have no idea what a program actually does. You just know that they select a film. My job involves me watching hours and hours of not wonderful things. And frequently, and like some of it's abusive stuff. Like I remember talking with a programmer who's like, sometimes when you're watching films, I'm watching hours and hours of women being sexually assaulted, because that is all the films that I am watching on that particular day. So like being clear of what our job actually requires and like who's doing it, I think will also change the conversation, because it's much easier from inside the house. You're like in it, and it's really hard to make those changes. But if you are clear about what is, sorry, I have a car going by. Like, if you make those changes, if you make it obvious what being a programmer is and like who your programmers are, sometimes it's easier to figure out how to hold that organization accountable. When you're in the middle of it, it's really hard sometimes to see the way in which you're doing things wrong. But if someone can actually see your process, see your system, look at it objectively, they can legitimately give you tools to hold yourself accountable. It doesn't have to be like, we're calling you out for like those numbers or this, like that. But like, for instance, they didn't realize that they had a class issue, because in their mind, their only issue was whether or not they had enough women. But now that someone else is looking at it, they're like, oh, by the way, this is an actual issue that you have that you didn't notice, because we just assumed you didn't have any women on there. But now we see, oh, one of the issues in your selection process is actually that everyone here comes from the very same exact socioeconomic status. And those changes you can't see from within, and people who are essentially telling you to change things can't see your system unless you make it clear. And I think having more visibility for what our systems are and how we're putting things in place will lead to us being more accountable. Because like we'll have more objective voices looking into the system and being like, hey, I can see how you missed that. You need to fix that. And I think that is important, especially in all systems, but especially in film and in film festivals.
Thank all of you. Let's not stop saying, hey, you have to fix that. I think it's like Kaleem was saying, we got to call it out. I don't want the pandemic to take away this possibility of conversations. You know, when it goes away, I hope we don't go back to what was before. I really want to keep the spaces that allow us to connect with so many people, as many people as we will have on the physical festival or more, and many more diverse opportunities to discuss what we really know and think is not right with this industry that's been created by certain people. It's been held powered by certain people, and it actually belongs to all the creators that make it, including, of course, those of you who write about the films and who select the films to go into the wonderful festivals that are out there. I'm extremely grateful for your time, and extremely grateful again to Sarajevo Film Festival, Documentary Campus, and everybody who's worked in this program. It's been some wonderful days of dreaming that I have an almost like a TV show live every day with these wonderful people. So thank you, and I will be seeing you all hopefully sooner rather than later out there in the real world or in the online world. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.